Hello, I am Renee Nicholson, and I am the director of the West Virginia University Humanities Center. And today I'm here with Ann T. Lawrence, who is the author of On Dark and Bloody Ground, an oral history of West Virginia mine wars. Ann and some others are going to be part of a reading and discussion titled New Books on the Mine Wars at Taylor Books in Charleston, West Virginia on Saturday, September 4th, 2021 from 2 to 3:30 p.m. So hopefully you can join us there. Ann is Professor of Management Emerita from San Jose State University, and she currently serves as the chair of the Case Research Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that provides fellowship to early career scholars for training in case research and teaching. So really excited to be talking to you about this book and as a lead up to the event in Charleston. And so just to get started, tell us a little bit about On Dark and Bloody Ground and how you came to write this book.
Well, thanks, Renee. It's really great to be here with you. Appreciate your having me on. I wrote this book in 1972. I was just 21 years old. So I have to say that it feels like a miracle to me that this book is finally reaching its audience. So I would just start out by saying to any of the older folks who might be listening, it is never too late to publish your book.
That is great advice for people.
Yes, the book that was published is being published 50 years after it was written. This book is, it's an oral history. It's an oral history of the West Virginia mine wars of the 1920s and 30s. I interviewed retired coal miners and their wives and family members about experiences that they had had mostly as teenagers and young adults. So they were recalling events in 1972 that took place mainly in 1921.
Wow.
The main focus of the interviews was an event called the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was an armed conflict between coal miners who were attempting to unionize and coal operators in southern West Virginia. Wow. It was an event that involved 10,000 people. And it ended when the President of the United States called out the US Army to break up the fight. And it was the only time outside of the Civil War when the US Army has been called out against US civilians or has fought against US civilians.
Wow.
So that's the basic topic. You asked about how I came to write it. There was a lot of serendipity involved. This was written with the support of a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which I believe is also one of your funders and is one of the supporters of the centennial events that are coming up soon. At that time, they had a program to award grants to young people under the age of 30 to do research in the humanities. And that was a short-lived program. I don't think they've had it for a long time, but at the time it was a wonderful way of giving young people opportunities to do real in-depth humanities research. So I was not the original grant recipient. The original grant recipient was the Miners' Voice, which was the newspaper of the Miners for Democracy.
Wow.
Reform movement in the United Mine Workers at that time. They had applied for a grant because they thought there should be more. They thought it was almost at the end of the period when interviews could be collected, where there were still people alive who remembered these events.
Wow.
And by the time the grant came through, they were in the midst of running the campaign for the presidency of the United Mine Workers. So if you know any of that history, this was the election where Arnold Miller and several others ran against Tony Boyle for the presidency of the United Mine Workers. Tony Boyle later went to prison for murdering John Jablonski, who was the person who had tried to run against him a few years earlier. So they were deeply involved in this campaign. They had the grant. They wanted these interviews to be done, and they didn't have the bandwidth to do it. So one of my very close friends from high school was working in the Miners for Democracy campaign at that time. And she said, I think I know someone who can do this. So they gave me a call. And at the time, I was a junior in college at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. I was studying history and sociology. I get this call, there's an opportunity to come and do these interviews in West Virginia. And I took a leave of absence from college and moved to Charleston.
Wow.
And so I considered it then a fantastic opportunity. I'm still very grateful to have had an opportunity to do this. And I spent the next 6 months driving around Southern West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and Southwestern Virginia with a little portable tape recorder and those little tapes that we used to use in this era, and tracking down old timers who might have some recollection of these events. So that was how I got into it. It just was a set of circumstances that came together to make this possible for me.
Wow. And what a leap of faith as a young person. You know, you take a leave of absence, you move to Charleston and are driving all over that part of the country. That's a grand adventure.
It was a grand adventure for me. I took a leap of faith, and I think the folks at the Miners Voice took a leap of faith by recruiting me to do it.
Yeah, that's exciting. And a great story behind the story. So you went out and you had your, cassette tape recorder. I love that detail because that really does speak to the time. And you collect oral histories, right? And tell us a little bit more about that process so folks understand, what is an oral history? What is this collection process? And how did you find the people to interview?
Well, that's a great question. I was not from the area. I grew up in Massachusetts and was going to college in Pennsylvania. I was an outsider. I relied heavily on networks. Initially, the Miners for Democracy Network and the Black Lung Association, which was an organization of coal miners who were fighting for their rights to receive medical care for Black lung disease, which they had developed as miners from breathing coal dust in the mines. So I worked through Miners for Democracy. I worked through the Black Lung Association. Of course, I had a lot of older members. I drew on networks of VISTA volunteers. This was a volunteer program like the Peace Corps, but a domestic Peace Corps essentially. And then there were some academic researchers who were already working on this topic. One of the people who was particularly helpful to me is a man named Lon Savage, who's no longer living. He subsequently wrote some important materials, including a book on the Battle of Blair Mountain. And his daughter, Jenny Ayers, recently completed a book for West Virginia University Press about Mother Jones. I have it here on my bookshelf. It's Never Justice, Never Peace. But Jenny Ayers, her father was someone who was very helpful to me when I was initially trying to make connections. But it's kind of it's like a snowball. Once you start talking to people and you talk to one person and then they say, there's somebody I know, I'll take you to meet them. And so one interview led to another.
Wow, that is really exciting and interesting how things interconnect and this idea of networks, even before we use them in the current technological way, that people really drive the connections and networks.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I just a aside about how I got around. I had a car, I was driving. This was before GPS and there were some maps. I relied heavily on maps, but they weren't very useful to me deep in the countryside and up various hollers. And I got lost a lot. I had to find a guy with a tow to pulled me out of a ditch one time.
Oh, wow.
And, I was really wandering around trying to find my way and trying to find my way to the people who could tell these stories from many decades earlier when they still remember them and were still alive.
Wow. Wow. Adventure plus, we're off the map now.
We're off the map, yes. We're off the map before GPS and no recalculating to get you back on track.
Right. Also, not the bossy voice that the people like to comment on the GPSs.
Oh, I know. The other thing is I grew up in an urban area and the streets were laid out on grids. Well, roads in West Virginia follow natural boundaries.
Right.
They follow the beds of creeks. They follow the edge of the mountain. And, there are no right angles. Right angles in rural West Virginia.
That is very, very true. Very, very true. Well, the people that you interviewed told you about events that were pretty controversial at the time. And some people even went to prison, for these events. So you're getting into some, pretty tight-knit communities, and you're talking about controversial things. So how did you gain the confidence of the people you interviewed, and how did you get them to talk to you?
I'm very grateful to the people who talked with me, and not everyone did talk to me. So the interviews that are in the book are the people who talk to me. I spent a lot of time with people. I spent a lot of time just sitting with people. And to be perfectly frank, at the time I was a smoker. I carried my cigarettes with me. I spent a lot of time sitting on people's front porches, sharing my cigarettes with them. A lot of the people I interviewed were smokers. And we would just sit there and smoke and get comfortable.
Sure.
I later kicked that habit, but at the time I think it was actually useful to me. Another comment I'd make is that in my experience, older adults are often isolated and quite lonely. And if you take the time to track them down and ask them about their lives and ask them questions about their experiences, they're often very grateful to have an opportunity to share what for them were very important memories.
Sure.
So there's really no substitute for just getting out there and listening, asking questions. And once we started talking, most people, once we got through the first few questions, usually I didn't have to ask any more questions. They would just talk. And I wonder sometimes why they opened the door to me. I mean, I was a stranger. Sometimes I was able to call ahead, but I wasn't always able to call ahead. I'm a very small person. I'm just 5 feet tall. Sometimes I think I just didn't look very threatening. If I'd been a big guy, they might not have opened the door to me, but I don't think I posed much of a risk with my little car and my little tape recorder.
Sure. Yeah. It's amazing what happens when you open a space for someone and then step back and let them fill it, right? And by listening and just being with them on porches, you did that. So that's really a remarkable thing that happened. And I appreciate you taking us through that, because gaining confidence really is a lot about trust and listening. Yeah.
It really is. I've gone back and listened to some of the tapes. I have to say I'm surprised at how few times my voice appears on the tapes, except at the very beginning. So I'll ask some initial questions, but then mostly what I hear from myself is, yeah. Tell me more about that.
Sure.
What happened then?
Wow.
It was, these interviews were quite unstructured.
Yeah. So you really did let them guide you through them.
Yeah. I was learning about these events along with them. I learned from them about these events.
Sure.
They were my teachers.
Yeah. Wow. So you get all these interviews, right? So is the book, these straightforward transcripts of the interviews, or how did you edit them to make them into the book?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I worked quite hard at that. After I'd completed the interviews, I transcribed them manually while I was a typewriter, but I transcribed them. But it seemed to me that it didn't work as a manuscript to just present free form, or not free form, but literal transcriptions of the interviews. So after quite a bit of experimentation, I hit on I guess I'd say a literary form of doing one entry per interview. And I interwove quotations or passages from the interviewee speaking and my own descriptions of the person I'd interviewed, the setting in which I interviewed him or her, and some of the historical context. So the book itself is a series of, I would say, portraits of individuals I interviewed that are more than just the individual speaking. It's my voice as well, describing what I encountered in the interview with them.
Sure. So you sort of guide us by giving us those other elements of story, giving us place and, those other kind of setting details that pull us in. I mean, it's hard to, not get compelled by those things. It's interesting.
So for the published book, we left most of that completely unchanged, except for a few footnotes. We added a few footnotes to provide some additional context, but you can't edit an oral hit. I mean, you can't edit what someone told you at the time. And my friends now say, wow, you published this thing 50 years later, you must have really rewritten it. Well, no, it was not rewritten. It's essentially as I wrote it at the time.
Wow.
I did add acknowledgments. The book also comes with an absolutely wonderful foreword written by Catherine Venable-Moore, who is a public historian. I wrote an introduction that there was some basis for it in the original report, but I worked on that now, a historical introduction. And the book also has an afterword by Cecil Roberts, who is the president of the United Mine Workers Union now. So I actually have an anecdote to tell you about Cecil Roberts. Catherine Moore and I thought it would be absolutely wonderful if he would write an afterword, or maybe just give us a blurb for the dust jacket. Sure. So we sent him a pre-publication copy of the manuscript, and said, we sent it to his, he's a very prominent person. We sent it to his assistant. And, would you be interested in writing an afterword? And we didn't hear. So we thought, well, that was a good try. We hear back from him. He says he loved the book. And not only that, but I had interviewed his grandmother.
Wow.
He said, I want to write an afterword to this book. And he grew up on Cabin Creek. I did a lot of interviewing on Cabin Creek. His grandmother was in the book. Several of his relatives were mentioned in the book. Wow. And he comes from a long family tradition of union activism. Wow. And so this was a very personal project for him.
Sure. Wow. And to have that connection to work you had done so many years ago, that's extraordinary.
It was very moving to me, and I had no idea. I knew who he was, of course, but I had no idea that I had this connection to him.
Sure.
We also, I just mentioned one other thing about this version of the book. We developed a new set of maps for the book, so that the different locations where the interviews occurred show up in these specialized maps for this book, so that viewers can kind of situate where these events took place. And there's a map of the Battle of Blair Mountain showing the movements of the two sides, the Union and the Operator sides in the conflict. And of all wonderful things, the maps were produced by my daughter, who's now a professional graphic designer. So she and I had an opportunity to work on this professional project together, which was a lot of fun.
Wow, that is so neat. So there's so many different layers to this book. You know, you having a connection with your daughter, the president of the Miners Union having a connection because you had talked to his family and about his family. I mean, just all these different connections are really extraordinary. So we know some of the people who are looking at this book through that, but who are you hoping will come to read this book and you know, really interact with your text?
Well, the people I interviewed were quite elderly when I spoke with them. Most of them were in their 70s or 80s. I think it's impossible that any of them are still living. It is impossible. But I do hope that their descendants may discover this book. And I would be absolutely thrilled if one of their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren discovered this book and learned something about their forebears that they might not otherwise have known. And that they have an opportunity to feel proud of what their grandparent had done, which had helped build the Union, helped build community in West Virginia. I would be absolutely thrilled. You know, the book will have more general audience, I think, among people who are interested in labor history or oral history. But if it reaches people in the families of these activists from 100 years ago, I think it would be really, really thrilling.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I'd like to kind of come back around. So it's been about 50 years since you wrote the manuscript. So why now? I mean, how did it come to be published now, these many years later? I mean,
that's just a great question. And as I said earlier, I think it's a miracle. It's a real thrill. So this was not published originally. I had a typescript manuscript. It was several hundred pages long. I made multiple copies and distributed at the time to libraries in West Virginia and Kentucky. But it was not formally published. And over the last few years, I have worked to try to get this material into the public domain and to get it digitized so it will be available to people who might be interested in it. I donated my original tape recordings and transcripts to the George Washington University Labor History Collection.
Nice.
It's mostly digitized and they are publicly searchable there for people who might want to use them for research or other purposes. And I also just tried to identify through Google searches, you know, who in West Virginia or Kentucky might still have an interest in these events, might be doing research. So in the course of that process, I discovered something called the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which is a recently founded, wonderful people's history, labor history museum in Southern West Virginia. And I didn't know if they knew about my work. So I tracked down the president, who is Catherine Venable Moore. I found her email online and I wrote her an email. And I said, you don't know who I am. You probably don't know what I'm talking about, but I did oral history in 1972 and I have the manuscript. And I see you're working on this amazing looking museum. And I'd like to donate a manuscript to you if you would have any interest. So I send her this email. I get an email right back that says, I can't believe it's you. I can't believe it's you. She said, we've been looking for you. And I'm like, oh my God, you've been looking for me. It turns out she had found the manuscript. She had come across one of the few copies. She had the manuscript. She had the idea that it should be published. And she'd been looking for me, searching for Anne Lawrence on Google. And apparently there are a lot of people with that name in the world. And she hadn't been able to find me.
Wow.
So my efforts, later in life to try to do something with my legacy work had this sort of happy landing. And Catherine is a remarkable person. She knows Derek Krisoff, who's the head of the West Virginia University Press. She said, "I'm putting you in touch with Derek. We're gonna get this done." And she really made it happen. I'm very grateful to her for her vision, her energy, her confidence and enthusiasm about this project, and her desire to see this through to completion. She's also written a wonderful foreword to the book that really puts it in context also of more recent labor struggles in West Virginia.
Sure.
Speaks to the relevance of it to current events.
Yeah, well, and even outside of West Virginia, I'm thinking about, the folks down in Alabama working to unionize at Amazon, and it seems like there's something in the general atmosphere that maybe this is speaking to our current moment, the way that history just sometimes does, right?
Well, thank you for saying that. I really hope that's true. It really speaks to the fact that history is built from the bottom up as much as from the top down. And
Sure.
Real ordinary people shape their own history, their own destiny through their own actions. The people I talked to were ordinary people. They were not public figures, but they had a historical impact.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I had mentioned the museum, the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which I want to give another plug for.
Sure.
I have asked that all royalties from the sale of the book be donated to the West Virginia
oh, wow.
Mine Wars Museum. So if you buy the book, which I hope you will, you should know that the proceeds will go to a good cause.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a really beautiful legacy. I'm glad that you added that. So, yeah. Well, and let's talk about this too. So we have this Blair 100 event coming up, and there are lots of fun and interesting and cool and important events. But what does it mean to you to be involved with the project, like Blair 100, and what do you hope people will get out of the reading and discussion at Taylor Books and all the other events?
There are some fantastic events that are scheduled, and for those of folks who are interested, they should go to blair100.com and see the full schedule of events. There will be music, there'll be readings from new books, of which mine is one. There will be theatrical performances, there will be reenactments of historic events, and the march that led up to the Battle of Blair Mountain is going to be reenacted. And President Roberts of the United Mine Workers is going to lead that march over a several day period following the route that the miners took in their efforts to bring the Union to southern West Virginia.
Wow.
So there's something for everyone, and I'm very excited to be part of it.
Yeah, when I heard about this event, it was one of those things that you just knew you got to figure out a way to bring people around it, because it is very much a part of West Virginia's history. And as the land grant university, we definitely want to preserve that history, honor that history, unpack and rediscover the way that these people, and I love that it is ordinary people, and that we say that, but ordinary people lead extraordinary lives. It's very true. So it's really exciting to see this come together. I'm really excited for the Taylor Books event, because there are so many people whose work there I admire, including yours. So I think it's going to be very special, not just for the event, but to help people reconnect to that history in our state and beyond. So But of course, I always have to also think about what's going on here on campus. And, one of the great things about the Humanities Center is I get to ask people like what you hope our scholars and students in the humanities on campus and beyond, really, what would you like them to know about your work?
That's a very deep question. The humanities are the study of humans. And I do believe that it's impossible to understand human history without seeing it from multiple points of view.
Sure.
And one thing that I tried to do in my research was to understand these historical events from multiple points of view. So I was then and am still very sympathetic to the Union. But I made this was a conflict between a union and coal operators and their allies. And I made a real point at that time to interview people on all sides of that conflict.
Sure.
So I think one point I would draw away from it is the importance of multiple perspectives on historical events.
Yeah. So such an important point. Multiple perspectives seem to be something in the current moment we don't always make the space for. So
yes. Listen to all sides, and the famous expressions, "What side are you on?" This was a very class polarized culture,
sure.
And it came to a shooting war. It was so polarized, and yet to really understand those events, you have to talk to people who were on all sides of it. I think one of the most moving interviews to me was with a woman named Georgie McLeod, who had one brother who was a union activist, and the other brother worked for Don Chafin, who was in the employ of the coal operators in Logan County, and they were on opposite sides of the shooting war. Wow. And that really brought home to me that this was a society-wide conflict where families were irreparably torn apart by this. To honor that history, we have to understand it from all points of view.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been absolutely enlightening. And I can't wait to see how things will unfold at the event at Taylor Books on the 4th. And I just want to thank you for taking a little time to chat with us about your book.
Well, thank you, Renee. It's absolutely been delightful. And here's the book, and please buy it and read it. And if you know people whose grandparents were in it, let them know so they can buy it and put it on their family bookshelves and learn some more about their forebears.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah.